So the audio is good. All right, I'm just going to close this. Got it. Okay, so. Oh. Oh, my auto advancer isn't working. What's the story here? No, it's not. Oh, well. Oh, yeah? Okay, great. Thank you. Maybe it's just battery.
No problem.
Yeah.
There you go.
Okay, and it's
Down
got
should go through the slides.
down goes to the slides.
Pointing at your computer.
Oh, yeah.
Great.
Okay, great. Okay, so. There we go. Okay. So yeah, so I'm going to talk, it's going to be, I'm actually a philosopher pretending to be a neuroscientist to make people listen to me. Anyway, so what I'm going to talk about is kind of ideas that are, I'm not going to describe my own work so much as try to synthesize work of a lot of people who have been looking at the evolution of the brain as a way of trying to find insights. And I'm going to ask essentially what that can tell us about sort of the big picture in neuroscience and what the sort of functional architecture is of the brain. And one common assumption that we have in neuroscience and psychology is that the brain is best described as an information processing system. So something that takes sensory input, does some kind of processing, makes decisions, builds knowledge, and produces some kind of motor output. And this is sometimes said that it's the principal function of the central nervous system is to represent and transform information. Now, information processing systems in the traditional sense from Newell and Simon here in the 70s suggested that essentially you take information from receptors and you process somehow and build some kind of representation in working memory that you can manipulate in some way to do things like make inferences, decisions, make plans, so these things may be in long-term memory, and in the end then produce some kind of an action plan. And this was the way they described it in sort of good old-fashioned symbolic AI type algorithms. But it still underlies more modern approaches which use things like neural networks to transform information from perception to action. Now, one reason why this is a very attractive way of thinking about brain functions is because there are a number of reasons. One is that if you know the input signal and the output signal to some system, then you can try to infer what the computation in that system is. There's many methods of doing this. And if that computation is very, very complicated, you can propose ways in which it breaks down into smaller computations that produce some intermediate representation. And if you propose a particular breakdown, a hypothesis on how this breaks down, then you can make a prediction about what that intermediate representation might be. And then you can look for it by recording neural activity in brains of monkeys or humans or mice or what have you. So it's a good way to break down big problems into smaller problems. And it can lead to a functional decomposition of something big like behavior into smaller problems like perception, cognition, and action, each of which can be subdivided further into other things like memory, decision-making, feedback control, et cetera, each of which can still be described as some kind of information transformation function. And these concepts, of course, this is very a simplified version of this kind of conceptual taxonomy. But then these concepts define the questions to ask. So I study decision-making of a particular type. Some people might be studying working memory or episodic memory. And so it defines us as scientists and therefore delineates the kinds of problems we address. And the questions we ask. So one question is, how does the brain represent information? Through neural activity patterns, we can look at population codes. We can ask questions about coding efficiency, decoding accuracy, et cetera. We can ask, what is the computation performed by a given region? Different areas and circuits, presumably that compute things through a particular transformation that we can hypothesize about and make predictions about. And then here's a quote from the Principles of Neuroscience textbook. The task for the years ahead is to produce a study of mental processes concerned with problems of how internal representations and states of mind are generated. So this basic idea is now defining how we do neuroscience. Now, as many of you know, this view has come been met with some challenges, and that neural data doesn't really act the way one might expect. So one example, well-known example, is that something that should be unified, like a representation of the world, doesn't appear to be. In fact, it's very distributed. So for example, in vision, you have a dorsal system sensitive to where things are, and a ventral system sensitive to what is out there, but no real place where it seems to be put together. And in each of these, there's multiple streams, multiple maps of space, for example, in a dorsal system. So that raises the question of how do you bind this information together? Conversely, things that one might think should be distinct appear to be mixed. So things like sensory, motor, and cognitive variables seem to be encoded in the same regions, even in the same cells. So for example, a lateral interparietal cortex here, through some set of experiments, looks like an attentional system that would be like the input to cognition. But another tradition of study suggests it represents the intentions to move the eyes and gaze, which would be more like the output of cognition when a decision's been made. So how can it be both? Likewise, things that one might expect to be serial appear to be parallel. So something like decisions and actions, you'd expect you make your decision, you plan your action, you execute it. And yet, these things seem to emerge in parallel across very vast regions of cerebral cortex. And an analysis, a meta-analysis done by Michael Anderson and colleagues, showed that if you look at a particular brain region and see what out there in the literature has been ascribed to it, most regions have a very high diversity of functions. So most regions are involved in many, many different things, and it's hard to see how they map to any particular computation. There are also conceptual challenges. I already mentioned the binding problem. How can you take diverging information about what is out there and where things are into knowledge that you can use for actually making plans? The grounding problem is even a more serious one. So this is really the question of meaning. How does this process know the meaning of this representation? How does that get encoded in some way? Now, this is actually a very old problem that's been plaguing artificial intelligence since the early days. It's called the framing problem. John Searle famously called this the Chinese room argument that many of you may be familiar with. Steve Harnett calls it the simple grounding problem. And we have suggested with some colleagues, and many people have suggested, that this underlies this sort of apparent lack of understanding in things like large language models, that they capture the syntax, but they don't know anything about meaning of the things that they're, the utterances they produce. So now one possible conclusion is that we're just not looking at the data correctly. Maybe we need more data, better recording and decoding methods. Maybe we need more elaborate theories that explain how information is bound, how meaning is encoded and transported in the brain. But one possible conclusion is that the traditional model is just wrong in some of its assumptions, that some of the basic assumptions are actually incorrect. And therefore, some of the conceptual distinctions which we have might not be the right ones. And I think one reason to consider this seriously, this possibility seriously, is when you think about what the origin of these concepts is. Where do these words even come from? They're actually very old. They're actually pre-scientific. And in particular, distinction between perception, cognition, action comes from dualism, right? The idea, very old idea that the mind is non-physical. That idea forced philosophers to conceive of an interface between the physical world that presents the physical world to the mind and another interface that plays out the free will of the mind onto the world, the physical world, right? Now, of course, the idea of the non-physical mind has been abandoned by most, if not all. The concept, the architecture that it forced us into remains. It was replaced by this thing we call cognition, but the architecture remains. And I think one of the reasons why this architecture basically remains is that these are just the terms we've come to use to discuss behavior. This is the language we use to talk to each other about what it is that we're doing when we do psychology or neuroscience. And many people have suggested that maybe these are not the right things. This is just not the right breakdown of concepts. I guess this is what Nicole was talking about earlier this week, because I know she's made this point. But Paul and Patricia Churchland made this back in the 80s, Lisa Feldman-Barrett, Russ Poldrack, Yuri Buzaki, Michael Anderson. Many people have been making this point. What if they're not the right terms? But then the question, of course, is if this is not the right terms, what is the alternative? How else to think about what the brain is doing, if not in terms of information processing functions? And also, how to subdivide the problem? Because we probably can't just say it's all one big mechanism. So how do we subdivide into something we can study? So I'm going to propose sort of tentative answers to both of these things in terms of, and I'm going to describe it as two controversial claims. So the first claim is that the brain is not best described as an information processing system, that it actually is better to describe it as a feedback control system. So in other words, the task is not to transform input into output, but rather control the input via output through the environment, right? In other words, do things that bring you to a good state, right? And that's actually a more specific type of information processing. It's not the class of all possible information processing. It's a very specific type where it engages in this feedback control that takes advantage of properties of the environment. And actually, this is not that controversial, right? I mean, would anybody really disagree with this? The whole point of having a brain, of course, is to do something useful, to avoid predators, find food, find mates, etc. So I don't really think this is controversial. What's controversial really is the second claim, and that's that accepting claim one changes everything. Once you start thinking about it in terms of a feedback control system, then you'll come with different, you'll come to different ideas of the way it should be broken down, what kind of representations and mechanisms might exist, and therefore the kinds of scientific questions we might want to ask in the lab. And so it's this part here that I'll try to convince you of. And to do that, I'll ask the second question: how to subdivide the problem, right? Because we can't all solve it at once. So I would suggest that instead of just defining the subdivisions at first, let's just first think about what would be the good strategy for finding the right subdivision. And I would suggest that we already agree that even if we don't know the real functional distinctions, we know where they come from. They come from evolution, right? Evolution produced the brain through a series of changes, and along the way, certain functions emerged from ancestral functions. And that laid down essentially the neuroanatomical and the neurofunctional distinctions that actually exist now. And as Dobransky famously said, nothing in biology makes sense except in light of evolution. So the proposal is, let's look at evolution and think about what stages happened, how the functions expanded, and how the neuroanatomical substrates might have been specialized for those functions. So I'm going to do that in my talk. But at first, I want to dispel a couple of myths about evolution. Because many people, for example, think of evolution as nature's way of finding solutions, perhaps optimal solutions, to problems posed by the world. A little bit like an engineer has a problem to solve and comes up with some kind of mechanism. And evolution is kind of like a tinkerer that tries a bunch of stuff to solve that problem. But the fact is that's not actually a good way of thinking about it, because in reality, evolution doesn't identify the problems at all. It just produces variations of some functioning ancestor and then favors those which happen to accomplish something, but only after really the solution's found, right? So the point is it tries stuff and some stuff works, but there is never a problem being defined, any kind of a sort of a cost function that's being optimized. And importantly, for a variation to even enter into this game of selection, it must first be possible as an extension of the functioning ancestor, which is still functioning. And importantly, this is very constrained. Only some variations can even be selected. And part of the reason is that the genome is a blueprint, is not a blueprint or a connectome for the brain. It's a recipe for how to construct the thing through a series of developmental stages. And like any recipe, stages depend on earlier stages. So you can't just modify an early stage, even if it would be advantageous in principle, because you'll violate the assumptions under which later stages work, and you'll create a big mess. So evolution can't just arbitrarily change the system. It can do only some things, like elaborate and elongate a developmental process. It can duplicate systems and then specialize them somewhat differently, differentiating them. It can back up and abandon earlier mechanisms. And that means that the mechanisms that we find in a descendant are going to be highly constrained by what the ancestor was like, right? Now, this, I think, is actually really good news, because what it means is that we can try to reconstruct what the ancestor was like by looking at how animals in different lineages evolved and what's similar. And also, it gives us a potential taxonomy, actually, of what are the different systems and how they emerge from an ancestral system. So the proposal is, instead of defining the systems, sort of based on like philosophical thinking about what the mind might be like, we should consider how mechanisms were differentiated and elaborated over evolutionary time after reconstructing that sequence. And I've called this strategy phylogenetic refinement. But what it really is just applying the comparative method of biology to theoretical neuroscience, using the same kinds of approaches. So to understand some structure of function, we always want to ask the questions: what was it before it became that thing? This is important to ask. And how did that modification expand behavioral capacity? Why was it advantageous, or why did it happen to be retained for one reason or other? And to do that, you always have to follow a chronological sequence, because every stage provides the context really for asking these questions about the future stage. So in my talk, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through the lineage that produced humans. Okay, so this is the phylogenetic tree of animals that I've expanded really only along this lineage. So I didn't expand, for example, insects, which is about 930 million species, because I'm mostly interested in this particular path. So this is the branch points where we diverge from different groups of animals. Thick lines are where there's fossil data. And I'm going to go through this lineage, this particular lineage of interest. And it's going to be rather fast. So it's going to be a bit hard to assimilate. There's going to be a lot of jargon. So the take-home message that I would ask you to try to get from this is that it's a continuous story of progressive elaboration and specialization along the way as these animals move through different niches. And I'm actually going to start somewhere over there, 3.5 billion years ago or so, with the origins of life. And I'm going to put sort of the people whose work I'm basing this on over here. So there's a general consensus that life emerged through the appearance of autocatalytic sets of chemical reactions, where you have some enzyme that catalyzes the production of another enzyme, catalyzes another, et cetera, closing the loop. Once the loop is closed, it becomes self-sustaining. So it creates a kind of primitive metabolism. And when these systems enclose themselves in membranes, you can now distinguish two kinds of metabolic control. One is control entirely within the membrane. So if you have some nutrient that you need to keep within a certain concentration, then you can exploit the laws of chemistry and internal biochemistry to essentially create a control system that maintains that variable. But some things you can't produce locally. You don't have the machinery for it, the chemical machinery. You have to absorb it from the environment. And sometimes you might find yourself where you're in a place where there isn't enough of this stuff. But then all you need to do is just move, even randomly, right? Even random movement is statistically likely going to bring you to a place where there's more of that stuff, assuming a non-uniform distribution. And that's also a kind of metabolic control, albeit one that briefly extends through the environment. And so this is behavior, essentially. Behavior is a way of controlling the state of having this stuff by creating some kind of a movement that improves your state. And many people have suggested this. In other words, if you have a required nutrient state that differs from your current nutrient state, then there's some drive. There's something that needs to be satisfied. Let's just call it hunger for now. And then that motivates a movement which results in bringing you to more food, perhaps. So I'm going to define this thing. The impetus is really the condition. It's a little bit like drive. It's the conditions that motivate an action, right? And then the action is one that eliminates that impetus. So essentially, the external part is creating this feedback loop. And that'll be your nutrient balance system. So from this perspective, the task of behavior is not really to build knowledge about the world, about the environment. It's rather to complement the dynamics of the environment in such a way that the whole system flows towards a desirable state where you have satisfied this required nutrient. And this is a very old idea, at least dating back 130 years back to Dewey, John Dewey, who said, what we have is a circuit. The motor response determines the stimulus just as truly as sensory stimulus determines movement. He said this in an article that was criticizing psychology's focus on stimulus response behavior. He suggested that's not what behavior is actually about. And I think he was right. And I don't think it's really controversial. So the point is that if you have a feedback system like this, and if neurons are implementing this aspect of sort of metabolic control that extends to the environment, then it's perhaps not that surprising that neurons emerged as a specialization of the ectoderm. So now, in these early eumetazoans, the nervous system was a diffuse net around the cup-shaped body with two specializations: an apical nervous system, which was rich in sort of chemosensitive and photosensitive receptors, as well as a blastoporal nervous system around the blastopore that controlled contraction activity. These animals foraged around their environment through something called levee walks or levee flights, where you make a number of small movements in a local area, sort of exploiting and sort of absorbing nutrients in a particular patch. But every once in a while, making a more long-range movement to bring itself to another patch. And this actually turns out to be a very good way of foraging in a non-uniformly distributed environment if you don't have anything more sophisticated. And Thomas Hills and others have suggested that arbitrating between these two modes of activity was the original role of dopamine, of sort of tonic dopamine, that if things are good, if your intake rate is high, your dopamine is high, and so you stay more local. But if your intake rate drops, then your dopamine levels drop, and that induces this kind of exploratory bout where you bring yourself to a new patch. So the apical nervous system would be sort of secreting dopamine to control the patterns of movement at the blastoporal to make it either local or long range. Now, that means we can take this simple control loop and make it slightly less simple. So now we have two conditions you could be in. One is you're hungry and there's food present and there's a good intake rate. And so you will kind of want to stay in that environment. And that'll have the effect of improving your nutrient state, but it'll also deplete the food. So these dotted lines are sort of inhibitory. So then if your food is depleted and you're still hungry, then you're going to be in this state, right? This condition where you're not have a good intake, but you're still hungry. Now you want to make a long range move. The effect of that, hopefully, is to bring you to a site of more food. So the proposal then that I would make is that the apical nervous system was doing this kind of stuff by secreting things like serotonin, neuropeptide Y, dopamine, to control the blastoporal nervous system, which controlled these different kinds of movement statistics. Now notice that what makes this system adaptive is that the total sign around every loop is negative, right? So it's a negative feedback system. It means it always tends towards that desirable state. But notice what happens if we ignore the environment. And if we just think about it in terms of stimulus and response, then we don't see that, right? We don't see that adaptive nature. And John Dewey said this too. He said the reflex arc theory gives us one disjointed part of the process as if it were the whole. But again, you're missing the picture if you do that. What we have is a circuit. So now, this organization can still be seen in nidarians, which includes things like jellyfish and anemones, et cetera, where you have this apical and blastoporal nervous system. In our lineage, the bilaterians, the body elongated, so the blastopore got stretched. It fused into a tube, and the apical and blastoporal nervous systems merged and overlapped at one end of the body, which is where the head will wind up, and the brain. This organization can still be seen in protostomes, which includes things like mollusks, insects, and the gigantic part of the animal tree. But in our, so where the nervous system is sort of ventrally oriented. In our branch, the deuterostomes, the body flipped dorsoventrally, and the neural plate here folded into a tube, creating the basic tube-like topology of all chordate nervous systems. So all our nervous systems are topologically a tube composed of these segments called neuromeres. And the front segment is sort of where the apical and blastoporal nervous systems merged, and the rest of it is like where the blastoporal system was. And if we look at early chordates, so the Amphioxus is a creature that's been studied, we can see, so this is sort of like if you take this tube and you cut it at the roof plate and unfold it, it would look like something like this, and it continues in this direction. And it's a little bit like a hypothalamus attached to a spinal cord. This will be homologous to the hypothalamus. This part will be homologous to the spinal cord. And so you have this sort of dopamine secretions to control sort of the undulatory locomotion that moves these creatures around. Now, these creatures also possessed a simple visual escape circuit based on a single patch of photosensitive cells projecting to a structure, we'll tentatively call it the tectum, over here, that then ipsilaterally projected downstream. So if a shadow falls on the animal, it quickly swims away. And you can see all these things in the amphioxus. And this is probably homologous to the circuits in vertebrates. Now, what happened in early vertebrates is this patch of photosensitive cells split into two. This is the theory of Ann Butler on the vision first, sometimes called the vision first theory, where the eyes migrated to the sides of the head. And if the projections became primarily contralateral, right, then you'll have adaptive escape behavior. Because if a shadow falls in your left eye, it's going to cause you to first contract on the right and therefore turn to the right. And you'll continue sort of differentially turning until you've oriented yourself away from the threat, and then you can swim away very rapidly. So this simple contralateral and ipsilateral projection type is very adaptive. Now, later on, this expanded a bit, so you have some retinotopy now, retinotopic projections from retina to this tectum, and a specialization of the rostral part of the tectum to now project not ipsilaterally, but contralaterally, right? So now if you have something on the left, on the right, you'll contract to the right, and so you'll now turn towards it. So now you have two systems, one for approaching things and one's for avoiding things. So contralateral approach, contralateral ipsilateral avoidance system. And these animals originally, and many animals still do, the decision whether to approach and avoid something is based on very simple features that ethologists call key stimuli. Like, for example, if something is large and expanding rapidly, then you want to escape from it. You don't have to recognize it. Just get out of there. Now, these circuits can actually be found in all vertebrates that they've been looked at. So they're clearly seen in lamprey, which is a very early offshoot of this lineage. You can see them in zebrafish, and you can see them in rodents, where the tectum is the superior colliculus. And there's a medial part that's sensitive to upper visual space that projects ipsilaterally and is engaged in escape behaviors, and a lateral part sensitive to lower space and sort of food items, and that's contralaterally projecting involved in approach. So these systems have been retained in all vertebrates, even in monkeys. And I just want to make a note about how these work. And these do not involve building knowledge about the world, really. They're just pragmatic systems that get you a good outcome. Like, for example, so I call these pragmatic representations as opposed to descriptive or explicit representation. So if you have something on the left, you want to go to the right. So you have some kind of spatial map of escape actions, a mapping between space and space. If it's something on the left, you want to right, you want to go to left. If you have two threatening stimuli, both of which you want to avoid, well, then averaging is a pretty good solution. So you want to have sort of averaging dynamics on this avoidance part of the tectum. But for approach, you don't want that, right? If you have something over here, you want to approach something over here, you don't want to average, you don't want to go down the center. You need to have some kind of winner-take-all-like dynamics. For this, you need something where maybe one group of cells inhibits the other and vice versa, so that you can select just one direction to go in. Now, notice you could call this attention, right? And the superior colliculus and the tectum are, in fact, implicated in certain kinds of it. So you could call this attention because you're neglecting one thing in order to attend to another. You could call it intention because you're going to move to it. You could call it decision-making, right? But the point is that these labels aren't really important, certainly not to this creature, which really just wanted to get at the food source. So the point is, we're constructing a different model of brain function. It's not really about building knowledge, but just controlling interaction through these kinds of feedback loops. And the computations aren't serial representations, but again, nested feedback control loops, where they're not really descriptive and externally decodable. They're really just the right mechanism to get a good output, a good behavior. And it's a different conceptual taxonomy. These are not the terms you'd use to describe any of this. It'll be something more like this, that if you look at this type of metabolism which extends to the world, it has a state control aspect and a sensory motor control aspect. And the important thing about this is this actually maps to the structures that were actually existed at that time, the hypothalamus, midbrain, and spinal cord. So now if we go a little bit further, so now the neural tube from the side, and I'm going to show you one part that happened in vertebrates, very importantly, is part of the hypothalamus here expanded into what we call the telencephalon. So before reading all this stuff, I didn't realize that the whole cerebral cortex and all the stuff we tend to study is actually a bulge out of part of the hypothalamus. But turns out to be the case. So this consists of an external sector called the pallium, which receives sensory information like olfactory, et cetera, that projects to a subpallium that then projects downstream to sort of selectively activate different systems. So in the lamprey, this has been studied quite well, and it sort of selectively activates approach and avoidance. And importantly, this system receives a new type of ascending dopamine signal, which is phasic. So now it's not just dopamine telling you things are good or things are not so good. It's giving a more punctate response of what you just did right now was extra good. On do it again if you find yourself in that state. And essentially that gives us reinforcement learning, which presumably appeared around this time. And this was part of the reason, I think, that this branch did so well. Anyway, so now that you have this, you can learn what key stimuli you should approach and which ones you should avoid. It doesn't have to be hardwired. Now, if you look at lamprey, you can sort of distinguish different systems. There's in the pallium, so the pallium here, this outer portion, relatively quickly became specialized into a ventrolateral portion, much more engaged in sort of the local exploitation and doing things like learning key stimuli, as opposed to the medial pallium, which was more concerned with this other type of activity, which is going somewhere else. So rather than exploiting the world around you, go and navigate and find something else using things like autogradients, landmark, et cetera. And this part will become the hippocampus by the time we get to mammals. And the tectum and the midbrain here was still really the one driving moment-to-moment visual motor behavior using these spatial maps. So I'm going to skip along a bit faster. I do want to sort of point out that the cerebellum appeared around here in the hindbrain, conferring predictive control and so canceling out the consequences of your own motion. And this was important because it allowed our ancestors to become much better swimmers, much faster, and build larger bodies, et cetera, as indeed happened at that point. Now, when we get out on land, so I'm moving really fast now. When we get out on land, one of the things that really expanded is this pallium. First, the medial pallium, which is very large in amphibians, that allows them to navigate and find their way back to water and things like that. So the ventrolateral portion was still sort of dealing with the key stimulus learning, while the medial was doing more this navigational function. This continued to expand in amniotes that now live their full life on land. Again, the forebrain descending control of these midbrain system became more and more elaborate. And the thing in between here, the dorsal pallium, I would suggest was doing something a bit like key stimulus detection, but a little bit more geometrically savvy through its better projections from the thalamus. So again, a circuitry to detect the possibilities for action. So affordances is a term that James Gibson suggested, maybe you are familiar with, the idea that there's certain possibilities for actions around me. And I don't need to know the objects to know what I can do around them, how they constrain my movements and such. So here's an example of a simple kind of affordance detection of a place to hide, right? You don't actually, let's say there's this outcropping here. The lizard doesn't actually have to build an internal model of 3D structure of this thing. It just has to pick up on certain properties, like there's a contrast edge with brighter texture up here, darker texture down here. As I move towards it, the motion above is faster than the motion below. And if the contrast edge lies above my point of visual expansion, then it's something I can hide under. So it's just very simple rules for discovering opportunities for, let's say, finding a place to hide. And I would suggest that the dorsal pallium was doing this in amniotes and continues in lizards and such. Now, at this stage, what we have is still really midbrain control of the moment-to-moment metrics of movement. And the forebrain is really just doing more indirect modulation, turning this on. You're pointing at something where you might find shelter, or you're pointing at a food source, approach, or you're pointing at a predator, avoid. But in mammals, things changed dramatically because mammals retreated into a nocturnal niche, where they gave up a lot of the machinery of the visual motor control, became less useful, and elaborated much more this other system, which now, through stronger projections downstream, could actually control movement more directly. So the dorsal pallium became the neocortex, and with much stronger projections downstream. So instead of just activating downstream systems, it could actually control and guide movement and so on. And also, rather than this descending system through the tectum, could also select through the thalamic feedback back to the neocortex through the basal ganglia. So now in these early mammals, and now I'm basing this mostly in the work of John Kaz and Leah Krubitzer and others, comparing across mammals, their conclusion is that the early neocortex of the early forebrain of mammals was dominated by a somatosensory map, actually 5 separate maps at least, as well as a visual region and an auditory region. And this was surrounded, this is sort of granular cortex surrounded by disgranular, agranular regions like insular, retrosplenial, et cetera. And I would propose that the organization of this system became specialized for different types of activity patterns. So a medial system here integrated with the hippocampus for searching around and moving around and essentially guiding navigation to find food or shelter. A feeding system more laterally to ingest and eat food, as well as in between a handling system for doing all the things sort of in between, like digging in the ground, bringing something to the mouth, et cetera. Maybe a defense system over here. Each of these receiving different information, let's say from the visual system about different parts of space. So far away space, space near the face, et cetera. And then selection between different actions that are available to an animal at a time, at any given moment, would involve many other streams. In particular, this thing here, this lateral system that expands beyond key stimulus detection to do things like evaluate the thing that you're essentially orienting towards. Is this a piece of food or is it not a piece of food? If it's a piece of food, maybe you want to engage feeding. If it's not, maybe you should look around some more. So you can see this is already starting to look familiar, right? This is essentially the dorsal and ventral streams according to Goodine and Milner. Well, one is sort of specifying the potential actions you can do, and the other one is collecting information for making decisions about what you want to do right now. What's out there? What am I looking at? Is that something I want to approach or avoid? Now, selection between all the actions you can do, I would suggest, happens at 2 levels. One is by selectively invigorating one of these systems through these large diffuse thalamic projections that are being controlled by the basal ganglia. So the basal ganglia essentially selectively invigorating the part of cortex for searching versus feeding versus handling or whatever. And these circuits were there present in early mammals, as well as, by the way, this is also involves amygdalar circuits and hippocampal circuits. There's this essentially basic organization of forebrain for selecting between activating different systems. So now if you've selected, let's say, the searching system, you still have to make the decision of exactly how you run. And that, I would suggest, is not made by basal ganglia, but rather within this system through something like the winner-take-all type of activity that I described earlier for that early vertebrate. Essentially selecting in a representation of space that's sort of relevant for this kind of action. So you can imagine, let's say you're a mouse. There are many different directions you can run in, but if there's objects in the world, those directions become constrained to a particular family of actions that you might perform. And you could describe this as a kind of a desirability density function across the space of actions, right? So there's a sort of actions over here that are desirable, actions over here that are not desirable. Now, in this kind of condition, you can just sort of average that and just go down the center. But as you move through the world, that landscape is changing. That sort of landscape of events is changing. Here you can still kind of go down the center, but at some point, the forward direction becomes very undesirable. And now you need some kind of a competition. So cells that vote for directions far apart should compete against each other so that you make a decision to go one way or the other. It could be biased by things like a good smell over here versus some threatening noise over there. So the point is about this kind of selection here, the choices themselves emerge from the geometry. And importantly, I just want to point out that you could imagine, you could describe this as, well, you could plan ahead, but you can't really, in natural behavior, you can't get away with that because things can change, things can move. And so you have to be able to continuously specify that landscape, do this kind of selection on the fly, even while you're moving through the world. So it's a very different kind of problem than sort of selecting food on a restaurant menu or something like that. You have to specify and select actions in parallel. And this is where I could finally talk about my work, where we've described the primate decision-making system, action decision-making system, what we call the affordances competition hypothesis. The idea is that there are potential actions being specified by this dorsal visual stream that compete against each other, and that competition is then resolved in this system through a variety of biasing influences from other regions that might use things like object identity, et cetera. And so I think this probably is something that translates to early mammals. Now, in primates, what happened is primates expanded the cortex, in particular the temporal, parietal, and frontal regions, so much so that the whole thing curled around the insula, retaining still the topology, but you can see now this central region has become much bigger. They also returned to the diurnal world, at least some of them. And so they relied more on vision. And they expanded the behavioral repertoire, all the different things sort of subdivided further, all the different kinds of interactions, different kinds of locomotions, perhaps. So you have a lot more action maps with a far wider range. And now I just want to point out that there's good neuroanatomical evidence for these specific systems, like the reaching network, a grasping network, defense system, locomotion system in the medial wall. This is work from the group of Caminiti looking in detail at the neuroanatomy. They have their own dedicated pathways down to the spinal cord that don't have to go through a motor cortex. So you have these different systems, and of course they involve different information, from different visual information specific for things like reachable space, faraway space, object configuration space for grasping things. But then the other expansion that of course happened is the ventral part, the temporal cortex, which expanded beyond key stimulus processing to something a bit more sophisticated, like object classification, but still in the service of evaluating things that you have in front of you. And this is important because unlike rodents and our early ancestors, at least, that run around and forage by sniffing and bumping into things, primates can forage with gaze. So they can orient their gaze, think about something from far away, and then select between leaving the tree and going to that spot versus forget it, I'm going to go look at something else. And so this information here can now be used for selecting among all these different activities. Now, many of you are probably thinking, okay, that's great, but how does it explain cognition? How can you go to something really abstract that's not about immediate actions? And that's a good question. It's possible, of course, that there really was something new that evolved somewhere along the primates here that allows us to do more abstract things. But if we consider how continuous this thing was, it's useful to think about, well, how could we extend this thing to something more abstract? And so Giovanni Pazzullo and I suggest this example. I mean, suppose you're this monkey sitting in a tree, and you've got a berry over here, you've got some apples over there, and there's some things you can do. You can jump to a different tree, you can walk out on the branch, etc. Now, the brain of this monkey is going to have things like information about, the goods that may be available, and that might involve these ventral and two orbital systems, and also has the affordances that are available. So the berry is reachable. The apples are not reachable. But there is a branch that's walkable, okay? Now, if you can predict that the reaching to the berry yields you a certain valuable outcome, if you can make this connection, then you can reach to the berry and live and survive and evolve another day. But if you're slightly smarter monkey, you can predict that walking on a branch brings things in front closer. And if you're able to estimate that, yeah, it'll be close enough for me to make that apple reachable, then you might forego reaching for the berry and you might walk out on the branch instead, because you can predict that that'll make a reachable apple, a predicted affordance of a reachable apple, which you can then get and make that choice instead. So it's like one step look ahead in chess, right? You can see what state my action will bring me to, again, through the power of being able to predict consequences. So the proposal is that this frontal part, the expansion of this frontal part, is sort of taking the immediate affordances and sort of doing sort of a higher level of predicted affordance to make things like accepting the things that are in front of you or searching some more versus various sub-goals, et cetera. But again, still in the service of action, choosing action. So now, from this perspective, we can revisit some of those neural challenges, right? Why dorsal and ventral streams? I think it's pretty obvious. One is for specifying, one is for selecting. Why are variables mixed? Because here you have all kinds of sensory and motor variables mixed up. And if there's a competition going on between these different systems as well as within, they're all going to be colored by things like value and risk and what have you. So you're going to have a mix-up of variables for good functional reasons. Why should things be in parallel? Because you're actually, you are not, you did not evolve to do stimulus response experiments in a psychology lab. You evolved to deal with the continuity of behavior, where you have to decide while acting and act while deciding. So, and again, why are things so mixed up in the human brain? Presumably because if we're doing complex stuff with this architecture, we have to use the pieces in some clever ways. Anyway, we can also revisit some conceptual challenge. Binding is not a problem because activity is coordinated by virtue of being embodied. If you look at something, your ventral stream knows what it is, your dorsal stream knows how to get it. So you can sort of bind through the fovea. Grounding is kind of always there. The meaning of the action is, the meaning of the activity is always in the context of fulfilling some control system and dealing with some situation. But what about explicit knowledge? What about descriptive representations like me telling you about this work? So one of the things I would say on this is there tends to be a lot of debate in philosophy especially, but also in psychology and neuroscience about representations. It's like a boogeyman term. Some people say everything has to be represented. Some people say no, and there's a lot of discussion about it. And I would suggest that we think about representations as a kind of a continuum, from the very pragmatic to the very descriptive. So I don't think anyone can deny that something like pragmatic representation goes on. It's simply due to the dynamic coupling that we have within the brain with the environment, is going to have things that co-vary with aspects of the environment, but also aspects maybe of our internal state, like are we hungry or not? But then there's also descriptive representations, which are the fact that I can tell you that thing over there is an apple, whether or not I'm hungry or not, right? And so there is some sense in which we have knowledge. And so again, rather than arguing that it's all like this or all like that, we can think about it as a continuum in particular, because in some cases, things that were pragmatic first, which is really the thing you need, could potentially become more and more sort of detached from all these contextual mixtures, right? Some things could be detached. Like, for example, this exploration system in the medial pallium or hippocampus, which perhaps originally was about finding food, using cues and landmarks to find food because you're hungry. So it mixed up things like hunger with external variables. But once you have a system that's able to build maps of how the sensory world is changing or the order gradients are related, then it becomes useful to build those maps when you're just swimming around and you're not even hungry. And so it becomes more and more, because you could use it later. And so it becomes useful to detach some of the things from these mixtures. Object recognition in ventrolateral neocortex, you have these things that are sort of context-free to some extent. But if you look at, for example, insular cortex, there are cells in insular cortex that will detect food, that are sensitive to the visual cues associated with food, but only if you're hungry. And if you're not hungry, then they won't respond unless you stimulate certain neurons in the hypothalamus, which make the mouse feel hungry. So the point is, what you really need is something like the insular cortex cells that will guide your behavior to say, well, there's food and there's hunger, but it might be useful to have something in the front end to that system. These cells project to these cells that is more sort of context-free. But then, of course, there's language, which is sort of the ultimate descriptive representation, right? So one might say that how can this kind of thing pertain to language, right? Language really looks like input to processing and output, right? Now, I would say that maybe not, though. Maybe we can think about language in the context of a feedback control system as well, okay? And here's how I would suggest it. So I've described physiology as sort of control inside the body. Behavior is control through the environment. But of course, we can also exert control through other creatures, right? So imagine if you're a helpless human baby and there's some substance, but you can't get it for yourself. Well, it's very convenient that there happens to be in your niche a parent. And you just need to get the parent to do that thing for you, to get that thing for you, right? And because the parent is willing to do it, all you have to do, and very sophisticated, right? The parent is very sophisticated. You can get very complex outcomes just by doing something really simple, like crying or say, I'm hungry. The parent will figure out what it is that you need, how to get it, and it's very sophisticated, so you can control the parent really easily. And if you, with kids, know how easy it is for the kids to control us. So in other words, if you have a control system where in the environment there happens to be this benevolent complex agent, then you can establish very sophisticated control just through very sophisticated action outcomes through very simple actions that you emit that could be symbolic, just utterances, because this creature will act upon. So the assumption that makes this work is the behavior of others is sophisticated but predictable. And this doesn't have to be a benevolent agent. You can tell an animal to back off by making a threatening gesture, likewise. But the point is that you can get complex outcomes with simple cues, and they're very compact because you don't have to tell the parent exactly how to hold the bottle or where to find it in the fridge. You just have to say, I'm hungry, right? And so it becomes symbolic. It doesn't have to have all the metrics and like when you're controlling your own actions. You can just say something like, give me that, move away, or whatever. And the point is, this becomes more and more sophisticated with every generation, right? And so we've built up this sort of interactive control by building a more larger set of cues that we send to each other to get each other to do things that we'd like. And so it's not how meaning is attached to symbols, really. It's how do we take the meaningful interactions and represent them to each other using symbols, and then maybe internalize that to ourselves. So the point is that communication fundamentally is not just about transferring information. It's really about persuasion. And this talk is kind of an example. I'm trying to persuade you to think about the brain in a different way. It's not all about coding and decoding representations. It's not modules passing information to each other. It's control loops. It's control of interaction. And so in this context, the task is to control the input, and the architecture is nested feedback control loops. So you have most of the representations are going to be very pragmatic, very context-laden, not externally decodable in any trivial way, because that's not what they're about. They're not about carrying information. The modules are not going to be information processing modules that build these representations or receive them, but rather nested feedback control loops that accomplish something, again, pragmatic. So the functional subdivisions are not going to be things like, an attentional system per se, but more related to the ethologically relevant circuits where the dynamics are primary. And then the evolution of behavior is really the expansion of this further and further into more and more complex activities. And what we call cognition and all the things that we sort of put under that umbrella is something that evolved from more and more sophisticated sensory motor control, which is something Piaget said like 60 or 70 years ago. Anyway, so that's leads us to a different conceptual taxonomy. It's not these things. It's rather something like this, right? Different kinds of ethologically motivated subdivisions. The advantage of this is that it respects evolution, actually, that these things actually are subdivisions that could have happened, at least, I would suggest, over the course of evolution. And second, it actually maps pretty well to neural data. There's actually relatively specific mapping one can make between these things and particular parts of the brain, even in a primate. So I would suggest that this is perhaps a better taxonomy and a better set of questions to ask when we do experiments. Anyway, I thank you for your attention. This is kind of like a summary of everything. If you're interested, I know it was rather fast. If you're interested, there's a couple of papers that describe this. I'm working on a book, which will be a couple of years still, but if you're interested, here's some of the papers where this is described in more detail. Thanks. Yeah, sorry for taking too long. I know many of you have to leave. Yeah.
I was curious if you read A Brief History of Intelligence. So Max Bennett has
Yeah.
similar but very different.
Yeah.
Kind of, I was wondering how you saw those as relating.
Well, he sent it to me, and he said that he kind of got excited about it after my stuff. So he's sort of taken the same attitude, And I think he did quite a good job. I haven't read the book yet. I've read parts of it. He did.
Some of the details, like the dopamine uses, are slightly inconsistent with your story.
Yeah, I haven't.
He's more of a scientist.
Yeah, it's a more of a computer scientist view. I think. Yeah.
The broader community of people building on your sort of approach.
Well, I think a lot. So it's actually not that new, right? There's a number of people that have suggested this kind of stuff. It's just that it's actually, I think, particularly ripe right now to do this because there's so much nice comparative data, and the techniques on things like building the phylogeny or looking at the development of the brain are really powerful now. So I think we're better poised to do this. But Steve Grossberg did this in the 70s. He asked these kinds of questions. He just didn't know about, you know, the development of the neural tube. Nobody knew that stuff back then. So yeah, I think we're all kind of on the same wavelength. I mean, I think his book is, as you said, more about the computer science aspects, whereas mine is going to be more neuroscience-y. But we're all kind of the same. Joe Ledoux has a similar book. There's a nice one by Feinberg and Mallet. And Steve Wise writes one of these kinds of books every couple of years, actually. And they're all really good. He's focusing much more on primates and more on representations than maybe I would. But he's one of my gurus. So yeah, so this is, I think, this is not just me. Lots of people are saying this. Other questions?
Can I ask one?
Sure.
So if we are to drop this taxonomy that comes from psychology, what do you think the implications are for clinical psychology, clinical neurology? How are we gonna...
Yeah. Well, so clinical psychology, as you know, has been struggling with this for a while. You know, there's this issue of the DCM being sort of supplanted by the, I forget what the acronym is for, the RCOR or something. Was it? RDoC, yeah, RDoC. So people in the clinical world are aware of the fact that you can't just take clusters of symptoms and assume similar mechanism. And so they're now looking at neuroscience as a sort of a bright light that's going to shine it. But we in neuroscience know that our light is not that bright. We don't actually know the pieces that well. I mean, it's maybe better than just looking at the symptoms, but it's a complex problem. Now, what I'm describing here is a primate brain. So I think any of the things that I've come to would really be only relevant for things that are mappable to primate behavior, which I think is difficult because a lot of the clinical things we care about are very abstract, very hard to really map to the mechanisms that we have in primates. But any good theory about a clinical condition usually is based on animal work, right? What I'm suggesting here is that this could help this kind of perspective, or this additional, think of it as an additional set of constraints, right? We have neuroanatomical constraints, we have physiological data, we have all kinds of data. I'm just saying, let's add another set of constraints, the evolutionary constraints, because they eliminate certain theories fairly well that other sources don't. And so if we eliminate the theories, we can narrow down to the better theories, and then hopefully that can map back to the humans. But I think it's tricky. You know, some of the things do map pretty well, though. Like, for example, the basal ganglia being this kind of selective invigoration system suggests why it's involved in decision-making and vigor of movement, and all these things are sort of mixed up in weird ways. And the question of is it involved in decisions is not a yes or no question, because you subdivide the space of decisions differently. And like, for example, I would say, yes, it is involved in decisions between different types of actions, but no, it's not involved in decision of whether I go here or there with the same effect. So because the questions become different, the answers might be more informative. But I'm not a clinician. I'd love to be able to believe that some of my stuff will inform clinical work, but I think we're kind of far from that. Yes.
Think about things like fixed action patterns where animals sort of get triggered and they go into a state of taking feedback from the environment.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of that, and ethologists used to focus on that because it was a little bit more reproducible and robust. And a lot of these ideas are kind of like that. I mean, the escape circuit, for example, has a lot of internal self sustaining. So you don't need to have the stimulus continuously there. You'll keep running for quite a while after the threat has disappeared if you're smart, because this threat might really still be there, right? So there's a lot of, when I draw the thing extending to the environment, there is usually something extending within the system that keeps it going. So in some cases it's enough, and some cases it requires the environment. You sort of want to always be sensitive to the environment, but on the other hand, you don't want to be too dependent on it, again, because the predator might be hiding, but it's still there, right? So I do think this translates, Thanks. Yeah, Joe.
The claims as you were going along that was somewhat surprising to me was the one that the basal, they were just talking about, the basal ganglia is involved in decisions between systems, but within a system, it's not involved in resolving competition.
Yeah.
Wondering if you can point to some evidence for that. Help me think about that claim.
Well, first of all, I don't think it's, yeah, no, I know. It's not going to be as clean as I make it here, because I think what I actually think is going on is a little bit of like a narrowing down of groups of synergies, right? So there's a sort of a big picture decision about, am I going to move my body through space, or am I going to stay relatively local and deal with the things around me? That's sort of a big picture decision. And the basal ganglia is well suited for that, because the basal ganglia recipient thalamic projections to the cortex are these huge trees that just spread over millimeters of cortex, even in a mouse, right? So they can't really control details of this action versus that action. They can activate whole big constellations of systems, right? But within each particular behavior, I mean, the brain is not required to give us a nice taxonomy, right? And so, what I describe as between system is something big, like, are you walking or you're not walking? But if you are walking, there's going to be a certain map that's activated. The basal ganglia may still help to, for example, it may actually, the lateralization may still be two different systems. So even though they're both walking, one is walking to the left, one is walking to the right, that just might be because the anatomy has been like that for millions of years. So the point is that, and regarding data, there's a number of studies that have looked at the output of the basal ganglia, the GPI in particular, to see, well, so the striatum, of course, has lots of information pertinent to decisions. That's what people have looked at that. But the GPI output doesn't really have any of that until it's already done deal, right? So the cortex will have arrived at its decision very clearly by the time you start seeing it in the GPI. Now, you'll see it in striatum, but that's because it's receiving. I would say it's because it's receiving it from the cortex. The GPI doesn't really become predictive until the movement is about to start. So we've done these studies where we recorded in the cortex and the basal ganglia in this sort of prolonged decision tasks. And we'll have stuff in cortex for seconds before it's in the basal ganglia. So I think in the GPI, right? So the key is, what can the GPI do to cortex? And the answer is not select between different reaching directions, at least in the experiments that we've done. And some others have done this too. Then there's also, Robert Turner's work on inactivating the GPI in monkeys and showing that it actually doesn't make a difference to their reaching choices, right? But again, in all of these experiments, ours, his, and other people have done this, Tanji has done this, Hoshi has done this, they're always within system decisions, right? They're always about moving your arm here or there. They're not about switching between behaviors, right? Whereas in mouse literature, there's a lot more about switching behavior, sniffing versus running versus scrunching. And there, I think there is better evidence there that kind of decision does actually involve, switching mechanisms through the basal ganglia. So that's a way of this is kind of a way of reconciling those two literatures, right? One that says, nope, it's not. One that says, yes, it is. And the answer is, well, because they're actually different kinds of behavior. But, we could talk about this more. I actually think there's interesting subtleties in between where, my picture is already too much of a cartoon,
So if you have any more questions, you're welcome to come to the podium, talk with Paul, but for the sake of this talk, let's help me
Thanks.
join.
Yes.